Long before he became the commander who would confront Erwin Rommel in the deserts of North Africa, Bernard Law Montgomery was already shaped by a lifetime devoted to discipline, duty, and the profession of war. Born in 1887 in London, Montgomery grew up in a strict household where expectations were high and independence was demanded early. His father was a bishop in the Anglican Church, and the family spent part of Montgomery's childhood in Tasmania, where his father served as a religious leader. Life there was often difficult and demanding, conditions that helped forge the strong will and determination that would define Montgomery's character throughout his life. As a young man, Montgomery chose a military career and entered the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, one of Britain's most prestigious training institutions for officers. From the beginning, he demonstrated a serious and methodical approach to leadership. Unlike some officers who were drawn to the glamour of military life, Montgomery focused intensely on preparation, organization, and discipline. He believed that victory in war depended not on chance or bold improvisation alone, but on careful planning and the ability to maintain control over complex operations. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 provided Montgomery with his first real experience of combat. As a young officer in the British Army, he was sent to the brutal battlefields of the Western Front in France. The war he encountered there was unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Endless trenches stretched across devastated landscapes while artillery thundered day and night. In the early stages of the conflict, Montgomery was severely wounded during fighting near the Belgian border, an experience that nearly cost him his life. The injury forced him to spend months recovering, but it also gave him time to reflect deeply on the nature of modern warfare. When Montgomery eventually returned to duty, he carried with him valuable lessons from the horrors of trench warfare. He had witnessed firsthand how poor coordination, unclear leadership, and reckless offensives could lead to devastating losses. These experiences shaped his philosophy as a commander. Montgomery became convinced that successful military operations required careful preparation, strong morale among troops, and clear, decisive leadership. Decades later, when he faced one of Germany's most famous generals in the deserts of North Africa, those lessons from the First World War would play a crucial role in how he planned and fought his battles. The First World War became the crucible in which Bernard Montgomery's understanding of warfare was truly forged. After recovering from his severe wounds in 1914, he returned to the Western Front with a new perspective on the brutal realities of modern combat. The war had quickly turned into a grinding struggle of trenches, artillery bombardments, and massive infantry assaults that often resulted in staggering casualties. Montgomery observed these battles carefully, determined to understand why so many operations failed while others succeeded. Serving as both a frontline officer and later as a staff officer, Montgomery gained valuable insight into how armies functioned on a large scale. He saw how poorly coordinated attacks could collapse into chaos when communication broke down between infantry, artillery, and supporting units. In contrast, when operations were carefully planned and units worked together with clear objectives, the chances of success improved dramatically. These observations strengthened Montgomery's belief that preparation and coordination were the true foundations of victory. Montgomery also developed a deep concern for the welfare and morale of the soldiers under his command. The trenches of the Western Front were harsh environments where exhaustion, fear, and uncertainty constantly weighed on the men fighting there. Montgomery believed that soldiers performed best when they trusted their commanders and understood the purpose of their mission. Throughout his career, he would become known for visiting troops personally, explaining plans clearly, and ensuring that his soldiers felt confident in the operations ahead. By the time the war ended in 1918, Montgomery had gained experience that would shape the rest of his military life. He had seen firsthand the consequences of reckless leadership and poorly organized offensives. In the years that followed, he would dedicate himself to building a different kind of army, one based on discipline, preparation, and carefully coordinated action. These principles would later become the foundation of the strategy he used during the Second World War, when he faced the challenge of stopping one of Germany's most famous commanders in the deserts of North Africa. The years between the First and Second World Wars were a period of reflection and preparation for many military leaders across Europe. For Bernard Montgomery, these decades became an opportunity to refine the lessons he had learned on the battlefields of the Western Front. The devastation of the First World War had forced armies around the world to reconsider their strategies, equipment, and methods of command. Montgomery followed these developments closely, convinced that future conflicts would demand a new approach to warfare. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Montgomery continued serving in the British Army in a variety of staff and command roles. These assignments allowed him to study military planning from multiple perspectives. He became deeply involved in training programs designed to prepare soldiers for the complex demands of modern war. Montgomery believed that an army could only succeed if every level of command understood its responsibilities clearly. Officers needed to think quickly, communicate effectively, and maintain discipline under pressure. During this period, Montgomery also gained a reputation for being both highly competent and unusually demanding. He expected officers and soldiers alike to meet strict standards of preparation and professionalism. Training exercises under his supervision were often intense, designed to simulate the chaos of real combat situations. While some colleagues found his methods strict, others recognized that Montgomery's focus on preparation and organization could give the British Army a crucial advantage if war returned to Europe. By the late 1930s, tensions across the continent were rising once again. The political instability that followed the First World War had given way to new rivalries and expanding military powers. When the Second World War finally erupted in 1939, Montgomery was already a seasoned officer with decades of experience behind him. The conflict would soon provide the opportunity to test the leadership principles he had developed throughout his career. And in the years ahead, those principles would place him at the center of one of the most important campaigns of the war. When the Second World War erupted in September 1939, Britain once again found itself drawn into a continental conflict. German forces rapidly expanded across Europe, using fast-moving armored divisions and coordinated air power to overwhelm their opponents. Countries that had once seemed secure fell with alarming speed. For the British Army, the early stages of the war brought both uncertainty and urgent challenges as the scale of Germany's military power became increasingly clear. Bernard Montgomery was assigned to command the British 3rd Infantry Division, one of the formations sent to France as part of the British Expeditionary Force. The mission of these forces was to support France in defending against the advancing German army. For months, British and French troops waited along defensive lines while tensions grew. Many soldiers believed the war might resemble the stalemate of the First World War, with long periods of preparation before major offensives began. Those assumptions proved dangerously wrong. In the spring of 1940, Germany launched a massive offensive across Western Europe, combining armored breakthroughs with devastating air attacks. The German strategy quickly shattered Allied defenses and forced British and French forces into a desperate retreat toward the northern coast of France. As German divisions advanced rapidly, the British Expeditionary Force faced the real possibility of being surrounded and destroyed. During this chaotic period, Montgomery's leadership became increasingly important. He maintained strict discipline within his division while organizing defensive positions to slow the German advance. As the situation deteriorated, Allied command made the difficult decision to evacuate the trapped forces from the French port of Dunkirk. The evacuation would become one of the most dramatic moments of the early war. Under constant pressure from German forces, hundreds of thousands of British and Allied soldiers were transported across the English Channel back to Britain. Montgomery's division played a key role in covering the retreat, helping ensure that a large portion of the British Army survived to continue the fight. The evacuation at Dunkirk in 1940 saved the core of the British Army, but it also revealed how vulnerable Britain had become. Much of the Army's heavy equipment had been left behind on the beaches of France, and the threat of a German invasion loomed over the British Isles. Across the country, preparations for defense intensified. New units were formed, soldiers were retrained, and factories worked tirelessly to replace the weapons and vehicles lost during the retreat. During this critical period, Bernard Montgomery played an important role in rebuilding and reorganizing British forces. He believed that the Army's survival depended on restoring discipline, morale, and clear leadership. Montgomery insisted that soldiers must be thoroughly prepared for every mission they might face. Training exercises were conducted with increasing intensity, simulating the conditions of real combat as closely as possible. He emphasized the importance of coordination between infantry, artillery, and armored units, lessons he had learned during the brutal campaigns of the First World War. Montgomery also focused heavily on communication within the Army. He believed that soldiers fought more effectively when they understood the purpose of their mission and trusted their commanders. Unlike some officers who remained distant from the troops, Montgomery frequently visited training grounds and spoke directly with the soldiers under his command. He explained strategies clearly and encouraged confidence within the ranks, believing that morale could be just as important as weapons on the battlefield. As the war expanded across Europe and beyond, Britain prepared to fight not only in defense of its own shores, but also in distant theaters around the world. In North Africa, British forces were already engaged in a fierce struggle against German and Italian armies. The Desert Campaign would soon become one of the most important fronts of the war. And it was there, in the harsh landscape of North Africa, that Montgomery would eventually face the commander whose name had become synonymous with German battlefield success, the Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel. By 1942, the war in North Africa had reached a dangerous turning point for the Allied forces. German and Italian armies under the command of General Erwin Rommel had achieved a series of dramatic victories across the deserts of Libya and Egypt. Rommel's aggressive tactics and rapid armored maneuvers had repeatedly forced British forces into retreat, earning him the nickname that soon echoed across military reports and newspaper headlines alike: the Desert Fox. His reputation as a bold and unpredictable commander had become a serious concern for Allied leaders. The situation for Britain in North Africa was becoming increasingly desperate. Rommel's army had pushed eastward across hundreds of miles of desert, capturing key positions and threatening the strategic lifeline of the Suez Canal. If the Axis forces succeeded in seizing this vital route, they could disrupt British access to the Middle East, India, and vital supplies from across the empire. The consequences would extend far beyond the desert battlefield, potentially shifting the balance of the entire war in the Mediterranean. British forces in the region had already attempted several offensives to stop Rommel's advance, but the results were often mixed or unsuccessful. The harsh desert environment, long supply lines, and the speed of German armored attacks created enormous difficulties for commanders trying to organize a stable defense. Allied leadership recognized that a decisive change in strategy, and perhaps in leadership, was necessary if the Axis advance was to be halted. In August 1942, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill made the decision to appoint a new commander for the British Eighth Army in North Africa. The man chosen for this critical role was Bernard Montgomery. Known for his strict discipline, careful planning, and ability to inspire confidence among his troops, Montgomery arrived in the desert determined to stabilize the front and prepare for the battle that would decide the fate of the North African campaign. Soon, the cautious and methodical British general would face one of the most famous commanders of the war, and the confrontation between Montgomery and Rommel would become one of the defining rivalries of the Second World War. When Bernard Montgomery arrived in North Africa in August 1942, the situation facing the British Eighth Army was tense and uncertain. Axis forces under Erwin Rommel had advanced deep into Egypt and now stood only a short distance from the strategic Suez Canal. Many soldiers feared that another successful Axis offensive could break through the remaining British defenses and threaten the entire Middle Eastern theater. The desert front had become a place of constant pressure, where every decision carried enormous consequences. From the moment Montgomery assumed command, he began making significant changes. Unlike previous commanders who had struggled to coordinate large operations in the desert, Montgomery believed that victory would come only through careful preparation and absolute clarity of purpose. One of his first actions was to strengthen defensive positions around a narrow stretch of desert near the railway station of El Alamein. The geography of this region worked in the Allies' favor. The Mediterranean Sea lay to the north, while the vast Qattara Depression to the south prevented large armored movements around the flank. This natural barrier created a narrow corridor where the Axis advance could be stopped. Montgomery also focused on restoring confidence among the soldiers of the Eighth Army. Many units had experienced months of retreat and uncertainty, and morale had suffered as a result. Montgomery addressed this problem directly. He visited units across the front, speaking clearly about his strategy and assuring his troops that there would be no further withdrawals. The army would stand and fight at El Alamein. His message was simple but powerful. The British forces would hold their ground, prepare carefully, and defeat Rommel's army through superior organization and strength. Training and preparation intensified across the desert front. Supplies were gathered, defensive positions strengthened, and artillery units carefully placed to support the coming battle. Montgomery refused to rush into an attack until he believed every element of the army was ready. This patient and methodical approach contrasted sharply with Rommel's style of rapid maneuver and surprise. Soon, the stage would be set for one of the most decisive confrontations of the war in North Africa. A battle that would determine whether the Axis advance would continue toward the Suez Canal or finally be stopped in the desert sands of Egypt. After stabilizing the front at El Alamein, Bernard Montgomery focused entirely on preparing the British Eighth Army for the decisive battle that lay ahead. Unlike earlier attempts to halt Rommel's advance, Montgomery refused to rush into combat without overwhelming preparation. He believed that the coming offensive had to be carefully organized so that every unit understood its role and every element of the army could work together with precision. The battle, he believed, would not be won by improvisation, but by discipline, coordination, and superior strength. Across the desert front, preparations intensified throughout the late summer and early autumn of 1942. Reinforcements arrived from Britain and across the British Empire, bringing fresh soldiers, additional tanks, artillery pieces, and vital supplies. Engineers worked tirelessly to strengthen defensive lines while also mapping the vast minefields that covered large sections of the battlefield. These minefields, known as the Devil's Gardens, had been laid by Axis forces to slow any Allied advance. Montgomery's planners knew that breaking through them would be one of the greatest challenges of the coming battle. The British Eighth Army also received significant support from Allied air forces operating across North Africa. Aircraft flew reconnaissance missions over Axis positions, gathering valuable intelligence about Rommel's defenses and supply routes. At the same time, Allied bombers targeted transportation networks and supply depots, weakening the logistical system that supported the German and Italian armies. Montgomery understood that controlling the skies would be essential to reducing the effectiveness of Rommel's mobile armored tactics. While the Allied army gathered strength, Rommel faced growing difficulties of his own. Supply convoys crossing the Mediterranean were increasingly threatened by Allied aircraft and naval forces, making it difficult for Axis units to obtain fuel and ammunition. Many German and Italian vehicles had already endured months of harsh desert conditions. The stage was gradually being set for a confrontation between two very different commanders: Rommel, known for bold maneuver and rapid attacks, and Montgomery, who believed that careful preparation and overwhelming force would bring victory. Soon, the desert around El Alamein would witness the battle that would define their rivalry. In October 1942, after weeks of preparation, Bernard Montgomery launched the offensive that would become known as the Second Battle of El Alamein. For the soldiers of the British Eighth Army, this moment represented far more than another desert engagement. It was an opportunity to halt the long series of Axis advances and finally push Rommel's forces back across North Africa. The battle began on the night of October 23rd, when hundreds of artillery guns opened fire simultaneously, lighting the desert sky with a massive bombardment that signaled the start of the Allied attack. Following the artillery barrage, infantry units began advancing through carefully planned corridors in the Axis minefields. Engineers moved forward under dangerous conditions, clearing paths through the obstacles that Rommel's forces had laid across the desert. These minefields were among the largest ever constructed in the campaign, designed to trap advancing tanks and slow any attempt to break through the defensive lines. The progress was slow and difficult, but Montgomery's plan relied on persistence and overwhelming pressure rather than sudden breakthroughs. Axis forces fought fiercely to defend their positions. German and Italian units responded with artillery fire and counterattacks, attempting to contain the Allied advance. For days, the battle raged across the desert as armored formations clashed among the minefields and defensive positions. Tanks maneuvered across the battlefield, while infantry units fought to secure strategic ground, that could support further advances. The fighting was intense and often exhausting for both sides. Gradually, the strength of the Allied forces began to shift the balance of the battle. Montgomery had assembled far greater resources than Rommel could match, and his methodical approach ensured that fresh units were always available to continue the attack. As the days passed, cracks began to appear in the Axis defensive lines. The pressure on Rommel's army was increasing with every assault, and the desert battlefield was slowly turning against the once dominant Africa Corps. As the Second Battle of El Alamein continued into early November 1942, the pressure on the Axis defenses became overwhelming. Bernard Montgomery's carefully planned offensive had begun to achieve its objective. The relentless artillery bombardments, combined with steady advances by infantry and armored units, gradually weakened the defensive positions held by German and Italian forces. What had begun as a determined stand by Rommel's army was now turning into a struggle for survival. Erwin Rommel, who had built his reputation on rapid maneuver and daring counterattacks, faced a situation very different from the battles that had previously brought him success. His forces were suffering from severe shortages of fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements. Supply convoys crossing the Mediterranean had been heavily disrupted by Allied naval and air attacks, leaving many Axis units operating with dangerously limited resources. Tanks and vehicles that had already endured months of desert warfare were increasingly difficult to maintain. Despite these challenges, Axis troops continued to resist fiercely. German armored units launched counterattacks in an attempt to halt the Allied breakthrough, while defensive lines were reorganized again and again under constant pressure. Yet Montgomery's strategy was working exactly as he had planned. By applying steady and overwhelming force across the battlefield, he prevented Rommel from regaining the mobility that had once allowed the Africa Corps to dominate the Desert War. Eventually, Rommel faced a difficult but unavoidable decision. Continuing the fight risked the destruction of his entire army. To preserve what remained of his forces, he ordered a retreat westward across the desert. The withdrawal marked a dramatic turning point in the North African campaign. For the first time, the Axis armies that had once advanced so confidently across the desert were now being pushed back. Montgomery's victory at El Alamein had broken the momentum of Rommel's campaign and changed the course of the war in North Africa. The victory at El Alamein marked a decisive turning point in the North African campaign. For months, Axis forces had pushed steadily eastward, threatening Egypt and the vital Suez Canal. Now, the momentum had shifted. As Rommel's army began its retreat across the desert, the British Eighth Army moved forward with renewed confidence. For the first time in the campaign, the Allied forces were firmly on the offensive, determined to drive the Axis armies out of North Africa entirely. Bernard Montgomery maintained the same methodical approach that had brought success at El Alamein. Rather than rushing recklessly into pursuit, he ensured that his advancing army remained well supplied and organized. Montgomery understood that desert warfare placed enormous strain on vehicles, equipment, and supply lines. Fuel, ammunition, and spare parts had to travel long distances across harsh terrain. By carefully coordinating the movement of troops and logistics, he ensured that the Eighth Army could continue advancing without losing its momentum. As the British forces pushed westward across Libya, they captured key positions that had previously served as strongholds for the Axis armies. Ports and airfields fell into Allied hands, further weakening Rommel's ability to supply his remaining forces. At the same time, another major Allied operation was unfolding to the west. In November 1942, American and Allied troops landed in Morocco and Algeria during Operation Torch, opening a new front against the Axis in North Africa. With Allied armies now advancing from both east and west, the strategic position of the Axis forces in North Africa became increasingly difficult. Rommel's army was being squeezed between two advancing forces, and the possibility of escape was shrinking with every passing week. The desert war that had once seemed unpredictable was now moving toward its final phase, as Allied commanders prepared to bring the long North African campaign to a decisive conclusion. By early 1943, the North African campaign had entered its final and most decisive phase. Axis forces, retreating from Egypt and Libya after the defeat at El Alamein, had regrouped in Tunisia in an effort to establish a final defensive line. The rugged hills and valleys of Tunisia provided more natural protection than the open deserts where earlier battles had taken place. German and Italian commanders hoped that the difficult terrain might slow the Allied advance and allow them to stabilize the front. However, the strategic situation had changed dramatically. Allied forces were now advancing from two directions. Montgomery's British Eighth Army continued pushing westward across Libya, while American and Allied forces that had landed during Operation Torch were advancing eastward from Algeria. The Axis armies were gradually being trapped between these converging fronts. Supplies became increasingly scarce as Allied naval and air forces dominated the Mediterranean, making it nearly impossible for reinforcements or equipment to reach Tunisia. The battles that followed were intense and complex. Allied armies maneuvered through narrow mountain passes, capturing key positions that controlled vital roads and supply routes. Armored units supported infantry assaults across difficult terrain, while artillery fire echoed across the hills. Axis forces fought stubbornly, determined to delay the Allied advance as long as possible. Yet with each passing week, the pressure on the remaining German and Italian units increased. In May 1943, the North African campaign finally came to an end. Surrounded and cut off from escape, large numbers of Axis troops were forced to surrender. The defeat marked the complete loss of Axis control in North Africa and opened the Mediterranean to Allied operations. For Montgomery and the soldiers of the Eighth Army, the victory confirmed that the long desert war had been won. The campaign that had once threatened Britain's strategic lifelines had ended with one of the first major Allied victories of the war. The victory in North Africa transformed Bernard Montgomery into one of the most respected Allied commanders of the Second World War. The defeat of Rommel's forces at El Alamein and the subsequent collapse of Axis resistance across the region were widely celebrated across Britain and the Allied world. For months, the Desert War had seemed uncertain and unpredictable, with victories and defeats shifting the balance of power back and forth. Montgomery's success brought clarity and confidence to the Allied war effort at a critical moment. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill recognized the importance of the victory immediately. The triumph at El Alamein was not simply a battlefield success. It was a powerful symbol that the Axis advance could be stopped and reversed. Churchill famously remarked that the battle marked a turning point in the war. For the first time since the conflict had begun, the Allies had delivered a decisive defeat to German forces on land. Montgomery's careful planning and disciplined leadership had played a central role in achieving that outcome. Within the British Army, Montgomery's reputation continued to grow. Many soldiers admired his clear and direct leadership style. He believed strongly that troops performed best when they understood the purpose of their mission and trusted the plans of their commanders. Montgomery often addressed his soldiers personally, explaining operations in simple and confident terms. His ability to communicate clearly with the men under his command helped strengthen morale during long and demanding campaigns. At the same time, Montgomery's personality could be controversial among other Allied commanders. His strong confidence in his own methods sometimes created tension with colleagues who favored different approaches to warfare. Yet even those who disagreed with him recognized that his success in North Africa had demonstrated the effectiveness of his strategy. The careful planning, disciplined preparation, and methodical execution that defined Montgomery's leadership would soon be tested again as the Allies prepared for the next stage of the war in Europe. After the victory in North Africa, the Allied war effort quickly shifted toward the next phase of the conflict, the liberation of Europe itself. The defeat of Axis forces in Tunisia opened the Mediterranean to Allied operations and provided a strategic launching point for further offensives. Allied leaders now faced the enormous task of planning how to strike directly at German-controlled Europe and begin the long campaign that would ultimately lead to the defeat of Nazi Germany. Bernard Montgomery continued to play a central role in these plans. His success in North Africa had demonstrated his ability to command large armies and coordinate complex operations involving infantry, armor, artillery, and air power. As Allied forces prepared for future campaigns, Montgomery became one of the key commanders responsible for planning large-scale operations against German defenses in Western Europe. Throughout 1943 and 1944, Allied armies began gathering enormous resources for the invasion of the continent. Millions of soldiers were trained and equipped, while factories across Britain and the United States produced vast quantities of tanks, aircraft, and vehicles. Naval fleets prepared to transport entire armies across the English Channel, while engineers designed specialized equipment that would allow troops to land on heavily defended beaches. The scale of the coming invasion would be unlike anything the war had yet seen. Montgomery was heavily involved in the planning of Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy. As one of the senior commanders responsible for the ground forces during the operation, he helped shape the strategy that would guide the initial landings and the battles that followed. His methodical approach once again emphasized careful preparation and clear objectives. The lessons he had learned throughout his career, from the trenches of the First World War to the deserts of North Africa, would now be applied to one of the most important operations of the entire conflict. The invasion of Europe was approaching, and Montgomery would once again stand at the center of history. By the end of the North African campaign, Bernard Montgomery had secured his place among the most influential commanders of the Second World War. The victory at El Alamein and the subsequent Allied advance across Libya and Tunisia had done more than simply defeat an enemy army. It had shattered the momentum that Axis forces had built during their long advance through the desert. For many soldiers and civilians alike, Montgomery became the man who had finally stopped the legendary Desert Fox. Montgomery's success against Erwin Rommel was the result of a leadership style that differed greatly from his opponents. While Rommel was famous for rapid maneuvers and bold battlefield improvisation, Montgomery relied on careful planning, overwhelming preparation, and strict discipline. He believed that battles should only be fought when the conditions strongly favored success. By assembling superior numbers of troops, tanks and artillery, and, by coordinating them carefully, he ensured that his army entered battle with a decisive advantage. The victory in North Africa also had enormous strategic consequences for the wider war. With the Axis armies expelled from the region, the Mediterranean Sea became a far safer route for Allied shipping. The campaign also opened the door to future operations in Italy and provided valuable experience for the Allied forces that would soon invade Western Europe. For the soldiers who had fought across the harsh deserts of Egypt and Libya, the campaign had proven that the Axis armies could be defeated. Today, Bernard Montgomery remains one of the most studied commanders in military history. His leadership style, disciplined, methodical, and focused on preparation, continues to influence military strategy and leadership training around the world. Though debates about his personality and decisions continue among historians, one achievement remains undeniable. In the vast deserts of North Africa, Montgomery commanded the army that stopped Rommel and changed the course of the war.